Okay, so our speaker this evening is Ray, and she's going to be presenting on atomic design, what it is, and why you should use it in your projects, excuse me. As a front-end application developer with an award-winning background in hackathons, Ray bridges the gap of UX UI with front-end SPAs. Ray has spent the last few years highly honing her front-end web mastery, specializing in JavaScript, the React framework, React hooks, and database tools like Firebase, as well as incorporating team tools and enforcement of code standards with eslint, Airbnb standards, Git Flow, and atomic design. And with that, I'll go ahead and stop the share and pass it over to you, Ray.
Thanks, Jen, with one N. I'll start screen sharing here. And let me know if all the little Zoom thing is still showing up on my screen or not, because I want to make sure that's not distracting you guys. But yeah, thanks for coming to the talk. So atomic design to me is something I've used across a couple of different projects now. And the more I used it, the more I found it to be valuable. And I wanted to come and share it with you and hopefully give you reasons to think about using it in your projects. What I'd say it really boils down to is code architecture for front-end developers, but it also gives you a common design language that you can use with your design teams, people who aren't technical. So having come from the art background, it's nice to see things that bridge that gap. What is it? Well, it was originally created by, or coined at least, and then co-created by Brad Frost. And I'll have a link later in the description, one of the end slides, where you can go and see his web articles talking about it in detail. But he essentially wanted to create an organizational structure that people could use to scale, grow, reuse assets. And it's based off scientific principles. So you probably remember from science class, or way back when, atoms building into molecules, and those molecules building into organisms. And then we totally deviate off of the metaphor and go straight to templates and pages because all metaphors break down eventually. But the folder structures keep these names. And it's nice because mentally, we're all peripherally, vaguely familiar with them. We know, oh yeah, an atom is small. And then a molecule is small, but less small, that kind of theory. So you build upon each block as you go. I think it also gives a lot to reusability. And if there is one thing that I'd say differentiates it from other componentization structures that you could potentially employ in your projects, it would be that you can reuse each individual element. So if you have a button, which we're going to have in our project later, we're going to have a live project we're going to go through, you can use that button across your site. So a button usually would have what the button text, the styling of the button, and a on-click handler, like some sort of function that the button does when clicked. You can usually pass data down to the button from your components, and then send the event of the click back up. So that button then becomes a reusable piece that can be adapted across the website. So when would you want to use atomic design? Generally, a lot of the same things you'd think about with when to componentize, when to break things off into separate components. Are you repeating code? And you guys have probably heard of dry. That's the do not repeat yourself. I tend to pair that with rule of threes, where if you see the same code 3 times, you definitely know you need to refactor. The first time you write a one-off piece of code, not so bad. Second time, not great, but I mean, you don't necessarily need to refactor right away. And then by the time you get to the third one, you're using that a fair bit. You might be using it more down the road. May as well make it a reusable piece. Single responsibility comes from the solid design principles. It's the S, and it's just what it says. It's the concept that each file of code should have one thing that it does. So you may see React Router, and most of the examples have the navigation styling, the links that are displayed, as well as the router switch that switches between the different routes in the navigation. That's 2 different things, right? So that's the actual switching the data, as well as the HTML display of the navigation. And this also allows you to have consistent styling across all of your components. I was talking to somebody the other day who their enterprise level project that they're working on has a sign up form or a client input form that they need to have on several different places, and the spacing across 2 different places where the form was located was completely different. The way it resized to mobile to web, completely different. And you don't want that for a user experience. You want consistent styling, you want consistent forms, you probably even want consistent functionality when you get down to it. So atomic design is something that you can implement to have a better user experience and consistent styling. Now, I've gone ahead and made a kitten gallery live site on GitHub Pages. Let me just grab the link here for you guys and post it in the chat. And I'm going to navigate to it here as well. Sorry, my bad. I have dark mode. It's going to look strange. Here we go. Normal looking site. So it's pretty simple. It's just a bunch of cats. Everybody loves cats. And if you don't, I'm sorry. You should love cats. You've got a basic navigation up here. You can go to an about page. So you've got routing. You've got a basic title, description, and you've got this cat card that has an image, a kitty name, a description, and a button. Meow, meow. Okay, cool. Cute. So let's look at the code, some of the code behind this. Oh yeah, and a footer. So this, I've put together a stacklet. You can also check out, there is a GitHub repo. Oh yeah, you love cats too. Sorry, I can see the chat over here. Good. So this is the stacklet, and this is the GitHub repo. But if you look at the stackplets, it's kind of big, right? Like there's a lot of unnecessary content in just the app.js file. I mean, that's 207 lines just to do very little, it seems like. But if I can tempt anyone to come out of the chat and just tell me, what do you think is wrong with this? And I will simplify it here by showing this next slide that kind of condenses it down into a really sandwich format. What do you guys think would be bad about this code?
You're hard coding the descriptions or whatever.
Yeah, there's definitely some static hard coding going on for sure.
It takes time for when you loading the page, because it's a lot of static and a lot of code.
Yeah, it's a lot of code for it to load all up front, right? And I mean, we're using React for this, so it's kind of parceling it in a single application anyway, but our single page application, since it all goes through the index.js file, but it's still a lot. And even just from a human perspective, this is a lot of code to look at. And as we look at this, the condensed slide here, we can see that there's function app, function about, page about, and function page kittens. You've got 2 pages and a whole other function going on here. That's, in a way, it's easy to see them all on one page, but when you have to scroll above the fold anyway, it's a lot. It's a lot to keep in mind as you go. So let's talk about breaking them off into components really quickly. What if we took these functions and gave each of them their own file? You have got the app, and then you've got the 2 pages, right? Oops, sorry. I keep trying to scroll. So once you've got the 2 pages, you've got the about and kittens. They've got repeated code between the 2 of them though. So you've got the navigation that repeats, you've got the footer that repeats, and you've even got some elements in here that repeat, like the titles and the descriptions. So let's talk about how to use atomic design what each of those elements are and how they apply to our site, so we can break it down and make it hopefully a bit more accessible and scalable. So if anybody wanted to take this repo and say, I love puppies, I'm going to make a data object in JavaScript about puppies and make a whole new page, you can do that. Start with atoms, the smallest component. Obviously, small HTML elements that you can think of generally would comprise an atom. So Brad Frost's article, he's got several basic examples that I've got here on the right-hand side. The label, input, button. I say you can extend it out, obviously. This is just a small sampling. You can also do headers, paragraphs, images, anything that you find yourself using a lot that you'd like to standardize. They generally don't mean much on their own in isolation, but the point is that we're going to build them up to be more later. In our project, when you look at the site, let's take a peek at it again here. You've got this title here, which is a heading. You've got this title here, which is a heading. And you get this title here, which is also a heading. We use buttons once right now, but if more pages were added and you wanted to have a page of dogs that say woof, that's completely able to reuse exactly the same button, or at least it should, right? So here we have the code of the button, which takes two things. One is, and if you're not familiar with React, I don't want to go too much into how the components are broken off and they work, but I do want to explain how the data is moving and what it means. So the children is simply going to be the content between the brackets. So if you have a button, you generally want that button to have a name. Right now ours is meow. In the code down here it says children, but it can really say anything. We're passing that title down into the data as children, passing it down to the button. And the other is sound, which is something that we actually have on the kitten object. Let me tab out here again, go to the atomic design component. This is the object. So each cat has a title, which is their name, an ID, a description, an image, and a sound. So they can all say different things. So that sound is actually going to come off of the object model, which is passed down from a different component. Generally, the policy that I like to follow is data down and events up. So an event is something like the on-click handle that you'd have on the button, whereas the data is the object model that's going to get passed down from something like the page level, or if you have an API call, maybe you have that at the page level, maybe you have that put out on a service layer. Yeah, so it takes those two types of data, whereas the title takes not just children, which is similar to the button, but it also takes size, because for titles, they're a little tricky, right? You've got H1 tags, H2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever you're using on your site. So for this, we're making it a reusable function that checks to see what the size is and then returns the valid tags. So all that gets passed in when you make a title is the data that you need. You call the title component, you pass it the size, you pass what you want it to say, and if necessary, you pass it a class name. That's not always used. And yeah, that's kind of a cross comparison of two different atomic components. At the atom level, one, the button's a bit simpler, the H tags get slightly more complex. But hopefully you're already starting to see how it can scale up and be used, so that when you do a Git commit and you're asking for a pull request, the person viewing your pull request, if you've edited the way that the heading works, only has to view one file rather than all three places that we currently have it, which just cleans up, makes it a bit faster and easier on them. Molecules. So this is going back to the previous page with the atoms, where you had each individual atomic element. Now at the molecule level, you've got the label, the input, and the button all coming together to create a search bar, which we've all used search bars. Another place I'd say that you can see it quite a lot is forms, which I talked about earlier as an area where you may want some standardization. Yeah, you may not always have molecules in your site as you're building things up, and that's totally okay. Just my recommendation is, as you need particular folder structure, make the folder component. If you don't have a molecule, you don't have a molecule. I almost did not have one for this demo site, but I decided to take the text on the cards. So if we look at the site here, this text on the card is styled differently from the rest of the text on the website. And because I wanted that to be a consistent piece that I could potentially use in other cards, I thought, let's break it off. And yeah, but you could just as easily have those all as atoms. So it's really up to you. But we start seeing the title atomic element get used here, where we're passing it a size and a title. And the p tag could just as easily be an atomic component if anyone wants to practice breaking those out. On the GitHub repo, I actually have in the README file a few practice things. If you want to take that file and play with it, it is there as a resource for you. And now, an organism is a distinct part of the site, and it's where I think things start to get a bit more interesting, because we're all familiar with the idea of a header. It's been on every website we've visited. So things like headers, footers, reused pieces, like the card we have in our gallery is an organism. And it is a bit more robust than just the search bar, and it starts to build up a bit more. So I've got two organisms here from our code. One is being passed data of animal, which is our kittens, and the other is not being passed any data. So whether you're passing an object data or not, they can still be an organism. It's not about passing data down. It's about what the file is doing. And as we get into templates, again, breaking away from the atomic terminology, or yes, it's still atomic design terminology, but breaking away from the science terminology. I put a little bit of faux code here on the side because this is often how I think about a template. And in Brad Frost's documentation, he says that it can be not just the header and the footer and the body content, but it can be pieces, the way that the content itself is laid out. For our example, we didn't get that complex. It's just very simple, and you don't have to go crazy with it. But when every single page is using a header and a footer again and again and again, it makes sense to break it out into its own things. So here we have the template that's going to be past children. You've got the header and the footer, and then you've got all the content in the middle. So what's that look like in code? Just pretty much like I had it written out. You want to make sure that it is in, if you're using React specifically, you're going to run into a slight problem if you don't use the slashes and you use a div. Just be a little careful of that. For other frameworks, I can't speak to that at the moment, but for React specifically, just use the empty slash. Now, pages are more specific instances of your templates. So you've slowly built up to the structure and the idea of having the formatting and the functionality of your site, and now you're populating it. So I tend to think of pages as where you call your API. In this project, we have a local object model, so we don't actually have to call an API, but if you wanted to populate it with API data that had all of the same object model layout that we have on the kittens, you totally could, or you could just change the requirements that it's looking for to match the API. And every page is just going to get wrapped in a template. For our particular purposes, again, it's just that one template that has the header and the footer. But you could say, hey, I decided to make a bunch of animals because I love them. I have snakes, I have birds, I have dogs, I have cats, I have a whole menagerie. And I'm using that gallery a lot. So maybe that gallery, the profile card and the mapping of it becomes a part of your template. That's a practical application of it, just extending it to be what you need. So here we have the 2 pages compared again, only this time, previously we had them with the navigation, their unique content, and then the footer. And this time they're just wrapped in the template with their unique content. And some of that content is the title, which is a reused atomic component. So hopefully at this point you're like, oh yeah, that is cleaner. And even though it's more files, each one is more accessible. So rather than going in and editing something about the navigation links on that first app.js file where it was huge, having a git commit, pull request, and somebody seeing, oh, she edited this file. That's a lot of code. Okay, where is it exactly and what was touched and why? It just makes it a little bit cleaner to parse, a bit easier to understand, as well as from the development side, it makes it easier to go in and say, hey, I just need to edit my title. I need to edit the way it's displaying. I don't need to edit the text. I just need to edit something about the display. We want to change the color. We want to change the font, something like that. You just change one file. So one thing that I've definitely heard people ask is the folder structure. This is a folder structure from our project on the right at the end with atomic design implemented versus before, where it looks a lot cleaner, but it's deceptive because that was a 200-line file. And now all of our files are pretty snippy, like really short, and you can probably see most of them above the fold, if not very little scrolling. So want to recap now that we've gone through the website example, a few pros and cons about why to use atomic design or maybe when it's not best. Pros, I'd say documentation. You could say, hey, I like this idea about breaking things off into components, but I don't really want to use the atomic design structure language. Like I don't want to have atoms and molecules. It just sounds weird. And that's fine. That's definitely your preference. And you may say that you want to make up one on your own. And that's, I mean, there's definitely big companies that can and do that. They have their own particular formatting and the way that they organize their structure and their design styles. But I think it's really nice to be able to say, hey, we're using atomic design. Here's the documentation that we didn't have to write. Go look it up, get yourself caught up, and understand what we're talking about. So that's definitely one perk. Another big perk of atomic design is obviously, as I mentioned before, that scalability. You can take the structure that we currently have and expand it vastly. It's also reusable, which is part of how it scales, is the fact that you don't have to keep writing new headers. You can just keep using title, expand that file. So if I added a H6 tag, all I have to do is add it to that if statement. So I have an H6 on there, and then we're good to go. It's not great for small projects, which you may be looking at the project I built here and go, right, why'd you do that? Like it's pretty simple. It was only 200 lines. Like, did you really need to do this? No, I did not. This is definitely a sense of overkill. If I added a couple of more pages that reuse some of the logic, if I decided to expand this out, yeah, it'd be worth it. But this was a small scope where we could easily understand it in a single session. So I hope you'll look over the fact that it's a tiny project that doesn't need to be broken up into all these files. You'd be right to say that. However, I would say that for atomic design, implementing it on projects, if you know you're going to have something that's going to be around for a couple of years that you have to support, that's going to grow, and you're thinking, this sounds good, but let's just wait and implement it when we need it. by the time you need it, you're going to have a lot to refactor. So just be really careful. You don't want to have to go backwards and start breaking things off and planning it out. It's a lot easier to build up the structure early, like it is on this small project, and then scale it up than it is to try and transfer everything over when you have 17 pages and like 1,000-line files. Like you don't want that. Another area where it's not as great is when you have a client or a company that needs a lot of static elements that aren't reusable, that are one-offs. Obviously, it's not going to be great for that because it does so much better with dynamic flexibility and inputs. So definitely some things to keep in mind as you look at using it. Just to recap again, sure you all remember this graphic from earlier, but atoms to molecules, organisms, templates, so on. I would definitely say start with the atoms and build up for one particular purpose, and that is if you break things off into pages first and then into templates and so on, you tend to solve just the problems you have when you get to the atoms. You don't think about how it may need to scale and be dynamic. So if when we broke off that button, you don't think, oh, well, what if we wanted puppies and we need them to say woof? You don't plan for that. You just plan for the meow button that you currently have. So when you think atoms first, it makes you kind of process that in a slightly different perspective. Yeah, and the folder structure is nice because, as you saw before, you just dump all your atoms into your atoms and it just scales up and you always know where they're going to be located. So I think the only links you guys don't currently have is the after stack blitz and, oh, wait, no, you got them. Jen's on it. Thanks, Jen. And yeah, definitely check out Brad Frost's original article if you haven't already and you want to know more about atomic design. It is the source and he has a book and stuff as well. That's pretty cool. This is outro slide and thank you guys so much for coming to the talk and I'm happy to answer any questions and talk more about atomic design. Just let me know.